He said nothing when he heard it. I didn't take it. Then who did? I don't know who took it. I only know who was in that hallway. You will never say that name to Munsiok. He thought the call had already ended. Instead, it was only beginning to listen. Jang Munsiok lowered the phone from his ear as the private elevator opened onto the top floor of his London tower. The city spread out below in a haze of amber streetlight and old stone spires, lit gold against the dark. Somewhere past the glass, the Thames caught the last silver of dusk and turned it black. He'd spent the day locked in negotiations that would have broken lesser men, and for the first time since the car picked him up that morning, his jaw finally unclenched. Stephanie Linker had just told him she loved him. It was the kind of sentence that used to settle something behind his ribs. Tonight it lasted about 8 seconds. They talked for nearly 5 minutes about seating charts and a guest list that had somehow grown past 200 names, about whether the string quartet should open the cocktail hour or wait for the toasts. Stephanie's voice had been light, unhurried, laced with that soft laugh she used whenever she wanted him picturing her smile on the other end of the line. Munsiok had almost let himself smile back, alone in that elevator, thinking that for a man who trusted no one, he had somehow found the one exception worth the risk. He reached to end the call. Diho was already waiting by the elevator doors with a folder and a look that meant it couldn't wait until morning. A wire transfer needed his signature before the banks closed in 3 other time zones. Munsiok shifted the phone without checking it, sliding it into his jacket pocket as he reached for the pen Diho held out. He didn't glance at the screen. He didn't hear the small chime that would have told him the line was still open. For a moment there was only fabric brushing against the speaker, the muffled sound of heels on marble, the low hum of the building settling into night. Then Stephanie's voice came back. It had nothing warm left in it at all. Listen to me carefully, Jennifer. The words landed flat, deliberate, each one placed like a blade on a table. This family does not forget who cleans its floors. Munsiok's pen stopped mid-signature. He knew the second voice before it even answered. Jennifer Coffers, the young woman who kept his entire estate running with a quiet precision he'd noticed only in passing, never once in full. Her reply came low, measured, the sound of someone weighing every syllable because she already knew it could be used against her. I understand my place here, ma'am. I have always understood it. If you're catching this one live, drop the city you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because where this goes next, you will not want to miss a single chapter. He held onto that sentence. I have always understood it. The way a man holds onto a wound he isn't ready to look at yet, turning it over once in the silence of his own study before letting it settle into something colder and more useful. Stephanie's laugh drifted through the speaker first, light and social, the kind of laugh she used at charity dinners when someone complimented her dress. Good, she said, because I would hate for there to be any confusion between us, Jennifer. You know how confusion tends to end for people in your position. I'm not confused about anything, ma'am. Jennifer's voice didn't rise. It never did. Munsiok had noticed that about her months ago, in passing, the way you notice a good painting hung in a hallway you walk through too fast to really look at, the stillness in her, the way she moved through the house like someone who had learned early that drawing attention to yourself was its own kind of danger. He was noticing it properly now, for the first time, sitting in the dark with a signature frozen halfway across a page that no longer mattered. The document case, Stephanie said. The one from my private sitting room, it was there Tuesday night. It is not there now, and you were the last person with a key to that wing before it disappeared. I clean that wing every night at the same time, ma'am. I've never once opened that case. I didn't ask if you opened it. I asked where it went. There was a pause. Munsiok could hear faintly the particular quality of a held breath, someone choosing whether a sentence was worth the cost of saying it out loud. When Jennifer spoke again, her voice had dropped, careful in a different way now, like she was picking her way across ice she already knew was thin. I saw someone in that hallway Tuesday night who isn't staff, ma'am. I didn't see their face, but I know it wasn't me who took anything from that room. Silence. Real silence this time, the kind that has weight to it, and Munsiok found he was leaning forward in his chair without having decided to, his pen forgotten entirely now, rolling off the edge of the folder and onto the floor of an elevator that had long since closed its doors behind him. "You will repeat that to no one," Stephanie said, and every trace of warmth had gone out of her voice entirely, the way a light goes out of a room when someone closes a door on it. "Not to security, not to the other staff, and especially not to Munsiok, do you understand me? Because if you do, I promise you, Jennifer, I will make certain that every house in this city knows exactly what kind of woman steals from the family that took her in. You will not work again. Not here. Not anywhere I have a name worth using." Munsiok sat very still. He had built an entire career, an entire life, on being the most dangerous person in any room he occupied. And here he was, in the one room he had let himself believe was safe, listening to the woman he had chosen to marry threaten to destroy a young woman's life over a missing box he had never even heard of. He thought of the ring sitting in the vault 2 floors below them, the one his mother had worn, the one he had chosen because Stephanie had once said, in passing, that she loved anything with a history behind it. He wondered, with a coldness that surprised even him, what kind of history she thought she was building right now. "I understand, ma'am," Jennifer said again, and this time there was something underneath the steadiness. Not fear exactly, Munsiok thought, though fear was certainly part of it. Something closer to exhaustion. The particular tiredness of a person who has had to swallow the same insult so many times it no longer even surprises them on the way down. "I always understand my place here." "See that you remember it," Stephanie said, and her tone shifted again, bright and social, as if a switch had been flipped somewhere behind her eyes. "Now be a dear and have someone bring the car around. I told the Whitfields we'd be at the club by 8, and I refused to keep them waiting because of all this unpleasantness." Footsteps, the particular echo of heels against marble receding down a long hallway. And then, underneath it, so quiet Munsiok almost missed it, the sound of Jennifer exhaling, slow and shaking, alone now, unwatched, in a house that had just made very clear exactly how much her word was worth against her employer's fiancé. He sat with the phone still pressed to his ear long after the sound had faded into nothing, but the low hum of the house settling for the night. Diho was still standing at the door, folder in hand, watching him with the particular patience of a man who had learned, over 15 years of loyal service, never to ask his boss a question before he was ready to answer it. "Sir," Diho said finally, carefully, "the Hartwell papers." "Later." Munsiok's voice came out quieter than he intended, and he heard Diho go very still at the sound of it, the way anyone in his organization went still when that particular tone entered his boss's voice. The tone that meant something had shifted, somewhere, and the ground under someone's feet was about to disappear entirely. He thought about the document case Stephanie had mentioned. He had never once heard of it, which meant either it was something so trivial it hadn't been worth mentioning to him, unlikely, given the venom in her voice over it, or it was something Stephanie had never intended for him to know existed at all. That was the question that sat in his chest now, small and sharp as a splinter. What exactly had been inside that case, that a woman raised on old money and older manners would rather destroy an innocent woman's life than let her fiancé ask a single question about where it had gone? He didn't have an answer yet, but he intended to get one. What he did have, sitting heavy in his hands, was 5 minutes of recorded audio that told him more about the woman he was set to marry than 18 months of courtship ever had. He had watched Stephanie Linker charm rooms full of people who could have ended his empire with a single phone call, watched her navigate his world with a poise that made her seem untouchable, unbreakable, exactly the kind of partner a man in his position was supposed to want standing beside him. He had never once, not in 18 months, heard her sound the way she had sounded in that hallway. Cold, certain, cruel in a way that came so naturally it barely required effort. And Jennifer, quiet, careful, steady Jennifer, who he now realized he had walked past in his own house nearly every day for the better part of a year, without ever once learning a single thing about her beyond her name. Jennifer had taken every one of those threats without a single crack in her voice, without a single plea, without once reaching for the obvious lifeline of simply telling the truth to the man whose house she stood in. She had chosen silence, deliberately, even with everything on the line. That told him something too, something that mattered more in the end than anything Stephanie had said. He rose from his desk slowly. The folder Diho had brought forgotten entirely on the leather blotter, and walked to the window that ran floor to ceiling along the far wall. The city spread out below him in 1,000 small points of light, indifferent to what had just happened 40 floors above the street. Somewhere out there, Jennifer Coffers was standing in a hallway with her hands folded and her voice steady, protecting a secret that had nothing to do with theft and everything, he suspected, to do with something far more dangerous than a missing box. And somewhere in this house, tonight, his fiancée was calling for a car to take her to a club, humming to herself, already certain the matter was closed. She had no idea the line had never disconnected. She had no idea that the man she thought she knew, the one who trusted almost no one, who had built his entire life around never being caught off guard, had just quietly, permanently begun rebuilding the terms of everything between them, starting from a foundation she had just shattered without ever knowing he was standing on it. If you have ever watched someone with power look right through a good woman like she was furniture, if you have ever bitten your tongue in a room because speaking the truth would have cost you your job, your home, everything you'd built, then you already know exactly what Jennifer is feeling right now. Hit that subscribe button and stay with her, because a man is listening tonight who is about to make sure she never has to swallow her voice again. Before we go any further with Munsiok and Jennifer, if tonight's story is speaking to something in you, we've got 2 more full novels waiting that will wreck you in the best way. One will break your heart. The other will heal it. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to grab them, and if you're watching this on your TV right now, just grab your phone and scan the QR code on your screen to start reading tonight. Stories like this one don't come around often. Go get yours. 48 hours before that phone call ever reached Munsiok's ear, Jennifer Coffers woke at 5 in the morning in a 1-bedroom flat 40 minutes outside the city, the way she woke every morning, before the alarm even had the chance to earn its keep. She lay still for a moment in the gray light coming through the thin curtains, listening to the particular silence of her sisters breathing in the next room, steady, even, the good kind of quiet that meant the night had passed without incident. She counted 3 breaths before she let herself get up. It was a habit she'd never quite been able to break, this small private ritual of making sure, before she started the day, that the person she loved most in the world was still safely in it. Her sister Amara was 22 and had been fighting a blood disorder since she was 14, one of those illnesses that didn't have a dramatic name people recognized at dinner parties. Just a long list of specialists and infusions and insurance denials that arrived in envelopes Jennifer had learned to open standing up, because sitting down made the bad news feel too permanent. The estate job paid well, better than well, by the standards of most domestic work in London, and it came with something even more valuable than the salary. A private medical allowance Munsiok's household extended to senior staff, one Jennifer had fought quietly and persistently for 18 months to be considered for, filling out forms in the break room during her lunch hour, saying nothing to anyone about why it mattered so much. She got dressed in the dark so she wouldn't wake Amara, laid out breakfast on the small kitchen table with a note beside it. Back by 7 tonight. Took the good painkillers out of the cabinet in case you need them before then. Love you. And caught the 5:40 train into the city the way she'd caught it nearly every morning for the better part of 2 years, watching the sky change color over rooftops that all looked the same until, eventually, they didn't. And the estate rose up ahead of her like something out of a film she'd never quite gotten used to belonging inside. The house itself was the kind of beautiful that made you forget, walking through it, that beauty and comfort were not the same thing. Marble floors that held the cold of the night long after sunrise, chandeliers in rooms nobody sat in, a library with more books than any single family could read in 3 lifetimes, most of them never opened, their spines still stiff with the particular unbroken newness of things bought for how they looked rather than what they held. Jennifer moved through all of it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made a study of being useful without being seen. She knew which floorboards in the east corridor creaked, which vases had been imported, and which had been there since before the current owners, which mornings Munsiok liked his coffee black and silent, and which mornings, rare as they were, he wanted someone in the room with him even if neither of them said a word. She noticed things. It wasn't a skill so much as a survival instinct, honed over years of work in houses where being invisible was the safest thing a black woman could be, and being observant was the only real power available to her. She noticed the way certain deliveries came late at night instead of during business hours like everything else. She noticed the black car that pulled into the service entrance twice in the last month, always after 11, always gone before the morning staff arrived, its driver never once stepping fully into the light. She noticed that the sitting room in Stephanie's private wing had been rearranged twice in 3 weeks. Furniture shifted an inch here, a drawer left slightly open there. The kind of small disruption that most people would never register. But Jennifer had spent 2 years learning this house's rhythms the way you learn the sound of your own home settling at night. And she knew, without being able to say exactly how, when something in it had changed. She never said anything. That wasn't her place, and she'd learned the hard way, in another house years before this one, what happened to domestic workers who started asking questions about things that weren't technically their business. She'd been let go from that position for far less, for simply mentioning once that she'd seen the lady of the house's brother-in-law let himself in with a key nobody knew he had. She hadn't accused anyone of anything. She just mentioned it. And within a week, she was unemployed with a sister who needed her infusion paid for, and a landlord who didn't accept apologies as rent. So she watched, and she said nothing, and she did her job with a thoroughness that had earned her Munsiok's quiet trust even if he'd never said so directly. She could tell by the way he sometimes nodded to her in passing, by the way he'd once, months ago, asked Diho to make sure Jennifer's schedule allows for the medical appointments she needs. A sentence she was never meant to overhear but had, and had carried with her like a small warm stone in her pocket ever since. It was Stephanie who was harder to read, and harder still to work for. In front of Munsiok, in front of guests, in front of anyone whose opinion mattered to the particular image she was building for herself, Stephanie was warmth itself. A hand on the shoulder here, a compliment on the flower arrangements there, a bright little laugh that made her seem approachable, generous, the kind of woman who remembered your name and asked after your family. Jennifer had believed it at first. Had let herself soften toward the woman who was going to become the lady of this house. Had thought, cautiously, that maybe this position would be different from the last one. Maybe here she wouldn't have to hold her breath every time she walked into a room. That had lasted about 6 weeks. The moment the last guest left, the moment the last door closed, something in Stephanie simply switched off. The warmth didn't fade, it vanished, cleanly, completely, the way a light goes out. Instructions that had been requests in front of others became demands the second they were alone. A dropped tray, an honest mistake, was met not with the gracious, understanding Stephanie performed so beautifully for company, but with a cold, clipped correction delivered in a tone that made clear exactly how replaceable Jennifer was considered to be. Once, Jennifer had watched Stephanie compliment a guest's charity work, with tears actually forming in her eyes, real tears, or tears good enough to pass for real. And not 20 minutes later heard that same voice tell a junior housemaid, flatly, that she'd better learn to disappear better if she wanted to keep her position. That was the thing about this house that Jennifer had come to understand in her bones, the thing she couldn't have explained to anyone who'd never lived it. It looked, from the outside, like paradise. The kind of place people photographed for magazines, the kind of address that made people go quiet with envy when you said it out loud. And it was that, on the surface. But underneath the marble and the chandeliers and the champagne, it functioned like something closer to a cage, beautiful, gilded, and utterly unforgiving of anyone inside it who forgot, even for a moment, exactly whose comfort the whole structure existed to protect. She thought about her sister on the train home most evenings, about the infusions scheduled for the following week, about the particular exhaustion of loving someone with your whole chest while also doing the math, every single month, on whether that love was going to be enough to keep the lights on and the medicine paid for. She thought about how tired she was of being underestimated by people who had never once had to choose between rent and a doctor's visit. And she thought, more than she wanted to admit even to herself, about how much longer she could keep quietly noticing things in this house without eventually being asked, directly, to say what she'd seen, and what it might cost her in a place like this if she ever told the truth. She didn't know yet that the black car at the service entrance and the rearranged sitting room and the missing document case were all pieces of the same picture. She didn't know that in 2 days' time, Stephanie would corner her in a hallway and threaten to end everything she'd built in this city over a box Jennifer had never touched. And she certainly didn't know that on the other end of a phone that hadn't quite disconnected, a man she'd nodded to in passing 100 times without ever really being seen by him was, at that very moment, beginning to understand exactly what kind of woman had been quietly keeping his entire household running while he wasn't looking. What she did know, walking the marble floors of that house at 6 a.m. with her sister's medicine schedule running through her head like a second heartbeat, was this. Someone in this house was hiding something far bigger than a stolen box. And whatever it was, she had the growing, uneasy feeling that she was about to be the one left holding the blame for it. She was right to feel it, though she wouldn't know how right for another 2 days, because at that very moment, 3 floors above where she stood polishing silver she hadn't been trusted to know the value of, Jang Munseok was sitting alone in a darkened security office, watching the night of the document case's disappearance unfold in silence on 4 separate monitors. He had asked Deho to pull the footage himself, personally, at an hour when the rest of the house was asleep, and no one would think to ask why the boss wanted eyes on his own security grid. He watched the East Wing corridor tick forward in careful, methodical fashion. 10:58 p.m., a housemaid crossing frame with a laundry cart, nothing unusual. 11:04, the lights along the hallway dimming automatically to their overnight setting, exactly as programmed. And then, at 11:07 p.m., the frame simply went black. Not fuzzy, not glitched. Black, clean, deliberate, the kind of interruption that didn't happen by accident to a security system that had cost more than most people's houses. When the picture returned at 11:17, 10 minutes later, the corridor was empty again, the hallway exactly as it had been, nothing out of place to the untrained eye. But Munseok had not built an empire by trusting what things looked like on the surface. He rewound the footage 3 times, frame by frame, watching the exact second the picture died and the exact second it returned, and each time he came to the same conclusion. 10 minutes. Precisely 10 minutes down to the second. Systems didn't fail that cleanly. People made them fail that cleanly. Who has access to override the East Wing cameras? Munseok asked, and his voice in the empty room was flat, controlled. The voice he used when he already suspected the answer and simply needed someone else to confirm it. Deho didn't hesitate, though Munseok could see the way his jaw tightened before he answered, the look of a man who had personally overseen the installation of every camera in this house and took its failure as a wound to his own competence. Myself, the lead IT contractor, and whoever holds the master administrative password. He paused, which was issued to 3 people when the system went live. You, myself, and Miss Linker, at her request, for what she called peace of mind during renovations to her wing. Munseok said nothing for a long moment, turning that fact over slowly, the way he turned over every piece of information that mattered, not with shock, not yet, but with the cold, careful attention of a man cataloging evidence before he allowed himself a single feeling about it. 10 minutes of darkness, in the one section of the house Stephanie had personal override access to, on the exact night her document case had vanished. He had not survived a decade at the top of a syndicate, built on other men's blood, by believing in coincidence. Pull the access logs, he said. Quietly, I don't want IT flagging this to anyone outside this room, not Stephanie, not the household staff, no one. And if the logs confirm it was her override. Munseok's eyes stayed on the frozen black frame on the monitor in front of him. Then I want to know exactly what she was doing in those 10 minutes that was worth blacking out her own hallway to hide. He finally looked up at Deho, and something in his expression made the older man straighten slightly, the way soldiers straighten when they recognize the particular quiet before their commander gives an order that matters. And I want to know before she does that I'm looking. He thought, briefly, unwillingly, of the recording still sitting on his phone, Stephanie's voice, flat and precise, telling a young woman she would never work in this city again. He had told himself, walking away from that elevator 2 nights ago, that he would handle this carefully, that he would gather every piece before he moved, that a man in his position did not act on emotion, only on certainty. But sitting here now, watching 10 minutes of manufactured darkness fall exactly where her hand could reach it, he felt something old and familiar stir low in his chest. The same instinct that had kept him alive through the purge that put him in charge of his family's operations in the first place. Somebody was lying to him inside his own house, and whoever it was had made the mistake of doing it badly enough to leave a trace. He didn't yet know what was inside that document case. That question sat unanswered in the back of his mind, even as he watched the footage a 4th time. What, exactly, was valuable enough that a woman raised in old money would risk exposing herself this way to retrieve it, and threaten a member of his staff into silence rather than simply asking him directly what had happened to it? A missing family heirloom didn't usually require a 10-minute camera blackout and a threat serious enough to make a grown woman's voice shake in a hallway. Whatever was inside that case, Stephanie needed it gone, and she needed no one, least of all him, asking where it went. 2 floors below, in the estate's administrative office, Stephanie Linker was not waiting patiently for anyone to draw conclusions. She sat across from the head of household staff, a tightly wound Englishwoman named Priya who had run this house's day-to-day operations for nearly a decade, and had, until this week, never once had cause to question Jennifer Coffer's conduct. Stephanie had a folder open on the desk between them, termination paperwork, already drafted, already dated. Waiting only for the final signature that would end Jennifer's employment, and by extension, her sister's access to the household's medical allowance. "I don't think you understand the position this puts me in," Stephanie said, her voice pitched low and reasonable, the voice she used when she wanted something to sound like her idea rather than her demand. "A member of staff who was, by her own admission, present in my private wing the night an irreplaceable family piece went missing. I've been more than patient. I simply can't have someone I don't trust continuing to have access to this house." Priya's pen hovered over the paperwork without quite touching it. "Jennifer's been with us 2 years, ma'am. Her record is spotless. If there's evidence she took something, I'd want to see it before." "Are you questioning my judgment?" Stephanie's tone didn't rise, but something underneath it sharpened, thin and cold as wire. "I'm not asking you to conduct a trial, Priya. I'm asking you to protect this household the way you're paid to. Mr. Munsiok trusts me to manage matters exactly like this one so he doesn't have to be troubled by domestic disputes. I'd hate for him to think you're making that difficult." It was a threat dressed up as a courtesy, the way all of Stephanie's cruelty tended to be. And Priya, who had a mortgage of her own and no particular desire to test whether her employer's fiancé had the influence she claimed to have, finally reached for the pen. She had it halfway to the signature line when the office door opened without a knock, and Deho stepped inside, his expression unreadable in the particular careful way of a man who had spent 15 years learning to give nothing away in front of the wrong audience. "Miss Linker," he said, his tone perfectly courteous, perfectly calm. "Mr. Munsiok would like a word with you, now if you don't mind." He glanced briefly at the folder open on the desk, at Priya's pen still hovering above it. "Whatever this is, it will keep." Something flickered across Stephanie's face, so fast Priya nearly missed it, gone almost before it arrived, a flash of something that looked, for just an instant, less like the irritation of an interrupted errand and more like fear. She smoothed it over immediately, rising from her chair with the easy grace she'd perfected over a lifetime of being watched and admired for it. "Of course," she said, smiling, already reaching for the folder to bring with her. "Tell him I'll be right there." Deho's hand settled, gently but unmistakably, on the edge of the desk between her and the paperwork. "He said to come as you are, Miss Linker. He was quite specific." She looked at him for a long moment, the smile still fixed in place, though something behind her eyes had gone very still, very calculating. The look of a woman rapidly recalculating exactly how much her fiancé might already know. and precisely how careful her next words would need to be if she wanted to walk out of that study with her engagement, her freedom, and her secrets all still intact. Whatever calculations Stephanie made in that doorway, she made them alone, because Munsiok had not asked for her, not yet, not first. He had asked Diho to bring him Jennifer. She arrived at his study 20 minutes later, summoned by a message relayed through Priya that said only Mr. Munsiok requires your presence regarding the missing item from Miss Linker's wing. And she walked the length of the marble hallway toward that door with her hands folded in front of her the way she'd learned to hold them years ago, steady, composed, giving nothing away. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her head on the walk over, had prepared herself for accusation, for the particular humiliation of defending her honesty to a man who held her livelihood, her sister's medical care, her entire fragile stability in the palm of one hand. She knocked. His voice, low and even, told her to come in. The study was dim, lit only by a single lamp on the desk and the ambient glow of the city through the windows behind him, and Munsiok was seated with his hands folded in front of him in a posture she recognized immediately. Not the posture of a man preparing to shout, but the far more unsettling posture of a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting to see if the person in front of him would confirm it. "Sit down, Jennifer," he said, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. His voice carried none of the coldness she'd braced herself for. If anything, it was quiet in a way that made her more nervous, not less. The quiet of a man choosing his words with the same precision he'd bring to a negotiation worth millions. She sat, spine straight, hands still folded, and waited. "I understand there's a concern about a missing item," he said. "A document case from Miss Linker's private sitting room." "Yes, sir." Her voice came out steady, though her pulse was not. "I've told Miss Linker, and I'll tell you the same, I never touched that case. I clean that wing every evening at the same time, and I've never once opened anything inside it." "I believe you." The words landed in the room with a weight that seemed to genuinely surprise her. Jennifer's composure flickered for just a fraction of a second, her eyes lifting to meet his properly for what he realized was the first time since she'd walked in, as though she'd expected almost anything from this meeting except that. "Sir." "I've reviewed the security footage from that corridor," Munsiok said. "There's a 10-minute gap in the recording the night the case disappeared. 10 minutes precisely, beginning at 11:07. I don't believe that gap was an accident, and I don't believe you had anything to do with creating it." He watched her carefully as he spoke, the way he watched every negotiation across every table he'd ever sat at, reading the small things, the set of her shoulders, the way her hands, still folded, had gone very slightly still in her lap. "What I want to know, Jennifer, is what you saw that night. Not what you think I want to hear. What you actually saw." For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and he could see the exact shape of her hesitation, the visible weighing of two dangers against each other, the danger of speaking and the danger of staying silent. A calculation she had clearly been running for 2 days straight without a single person in this house making it easy for her. He had seen that same look on the faces of men across boardroom tables who held information that could end them either way, depending on how they played it. He had never once expected to see it on the face of a housemaid in his own home, and something about that recognition settled into him uncomfortably, a small crack opening in an assumption he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "If I tell you what I saw," she said finally, carefully, "I need to know that it doesn't put someone else in this house in danger. That's the only reason I haven't already said something. Not because I'm hiding what I did, because I'm protecting what someone else didn't do." Munsiok leaned back slightly in his chair. This was not the conversation he had prepared for. He had expected denial, or fear, or the particular pleading he'd grown used to from people caught in situations larger than themselves. He had not expected a woman sitting across from him, with everything to lose, negotiating the terms of her own confession like she still held a card worth protecting. "You have my word," he said. "Whatever you tell me stays contained to this room until I decide otherwise. No one loses their position for telling me the truth in this house, not while I'm the one asking the questions." She studied his face for a moment longer, and then, slowly, she nodded, and something in her posture shifted, not relaxing exactly, but settling, the particular ease of a person finally allowed to set down a weight they'd been carrying alone. "That night," she said, "around 11, I was finishing the east wing when I heard a car come through the service entrance. That's not unusual on its own, deliveries come through there sometimes late. But this wasn't a delivery van. It was a black car, no markings, and the man who got out wasn't anyone I recognized from this house or any of the regular contractors." She paused, choosing her next words with visible care. "I watched him go into Miss Linker's private sitting room. He was inside for maybe 8 minutes. When he came back out, he was carrying something. I couldn't see exactly what it was wrapped, but I could see the trim on it catch the light from the hallway sconce. Silver, ornate, not something you'd carry out of a house at 11 at night unless you didn't want anyone asking questions about it." Munsiok's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. The particular focus of a man filing away a detail that mattered far more than the person telling it to him could possibly know. A courier, moving silver-trimmed items out of Stephanie's private wing under cover of darkness, on the exact night his own security cameras had gone dark in that precise location. This was not a story about a stolen family heirloom anymore. This was something else entirely, and he could feel the shape of it beginning to form at the edges of his mind, even as he kept his voice level. "Why didn't you report this?" he asked. "To Preya, to security, to me." Jennifer's hands tightened slightly in her lap, the first real crack in her composure since she'd sat down. Because the same man came back 2 nights later, not to the sitting room this time, to the service entrance where he found Danny. She saw the flicker of confusion cross Munsiok's face and clarified quickly. "The young pantry steward, sir. 17. He's been with us less than 4 months, helping support his mother since his father passed." The man told him, very calmly, that if anyone asked about deliveries to the East Wing, the correct answer was that he'd seen nothing. And he made it clear, without ever raising his voice, exactly what would happen to Danny's family if he gave the wrong answer to that question. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, real anger moved through her voice, quiet but unmistakable. "Danny's terrified, sir. He's a child who needed this job to help keep the lights on at home, and now he's frightened to walk his own route through this house at night. I couldn't report what I saw without that trail leading straight back to him. So I decided the risk was mine to carry instead of his. I've been doing this work a long time. I know how to survive being blamed for something I didn't do. Danny doesn't." The room was silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Munsiok sat very still, and something was happening behind his composed exterior that he could not remember happening in a very long time. A genuine, unguarded recalibration of everything he'd assumed about the people who moved quietly through his house every day, unseen, unasked, and apparently far more perceptive and far braver than he had ever bothered to notice. He had spent 10 years building a reputation on the principle that loyalty could not be trusted unless it was purchased, that every relationship in his orbit was ultimately transactional, that people protected themselves first and everyone else a distant second if it cost them nothing. He had run his entire life on that assumption, had let it calcify into something close to a personal religion after the purge that put him in power, after watching men he'd trusted with everything turn on him the moment their own safety was threatened. And here in front of him was a woman who had chosen, deliberately, at real cost to herself, with a threat against her own livelihood already sitting on a desk 2 floors below. To shield a frightened 17-year-old boy, she had no obligation to protect beyond simple decency. She had let herself be accused, let herself be threatened with termination and ruin, rather than let that fear land on someone with even less power than she had. "You could have told me this the moment Miss Linker threatened you," he said, quieter now. "You could have come to me directly instead of absorbing the blame yourself." "With respect, sir," Jennifer said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a plain and weary honesty that struck him harder than anger would have. "In my experience, when someone like me tells the truth in a house like this, it isn't the powerful person who gets punished for it. It's usually the person who spoke up." She met his eyes without flinching. "I didn't know if you'd be any different." Munsiok sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere he hadn't expected it to reach. He thought of the recording still saved on his phone, Stephanie's voice threatening to end this woman's entire life over a box she'd never touched. And he thought of Jennifer sitting here now, holding steady, having just handed him, freely, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, the first real thread leading toward whatever his fiancée was actually hiding. "You were right not to trust it easily," he said finally. "But you can trust it now. Whoever that man was, whatever he's moving through this house, I intend to find out. And no one under my roof will pay a price for protecting a child from men like that. Not you, not Danny." He held her gaze, and something passed between them that was closer to respect than either of them had words ready for. "You have my word on that." If there is one thing this story is going to ask you to remember, it's this: dignity isn't loud, and it doesn't need an audience to be real. Jennifer just proved that in a room where everything was stacked against her. If you believe that kind of quiet integrity deserves to win, hit subscribe right now, because you are about to watch a woman like that get exactly what she's earned. He rose from his desk and crossed to the window, the city glittering below him in 1,000 indifferent lights, and allowed himself, for the first time in this entire investigation, to ask the question that had been circling the edges of his mind since the moment he heard Stephanie's voice turn to ice in that hallway 2 nights ago. Not whether she had stolen something, but how many other things, in 18 months of engagement, had she managed to hide from him without his ever once suspecting there was anything to find? He got his answer 3 hours later, and it was worse than anything he'd let himself imagine standing at that window. Monsiok sat in the same darkened study, though now the desk in front of him was covered with printouts instead of empty space. Phone records, financial transfers, a single grainy still image pulled from a traffic camera 2 streets from his estate, showing a black car with no plates, and a man in a dark coat carrying something wrapped in cloth, silver trim, catching the streetlight exactly the way Jennifer had described it. Across from him sat the head of his intelligence division, a wiry, soft-spoken man named Suk-Jun who had spent 11 years finding things other people worked very hard to keep buried, and who now stood delivering his findings with the particular careful stillness of a man who understood exactly how badly his employer was about to take what he was hearing. "The courier's been identified," Suk-Jun said. "Facial recognition matched him against an old surveillance file from 3 years ago. He runs logistics for the Vasilenko faction, the syndicate that's been trying to move into our territorial finance structure since before you took over from your father's people. We've flagged 2 other appearances by the same man in London over the past 4 months. Both times within a day of his visits, we saw irregular activity in accounts tied to your commercial holdings. Small movements, nothing that would trip an alarm on its own, but consistent." Monsiok said nothing, his eyes fixed on the still image of the courier leaving his own house at 11 at night with something valuable enough to justify blacking out a security camera to retrieve it. "And the document case," he said finally. "What was actually inside it?" Suk-Jun hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man who had been in this line of work long enough to know that some information changed the temperature of a room the moment it was spoken aloud. "Not a family heirloom, sir. That case held a set of encrypted offshore transaction codes, the master keys tied to your commercial reel, estate holdings across 3 jurisdictions. The codes that were issued to exactly 2 people when the structure was set up. You. And Miss Linker, per your explicit instruction, so she could assist with wedding-related transfers and joint account access before the marriage." The room went very still. Monsiok had given Stephanie access to those codes himself, 8 months ago, in a moment he now understood with a clarity that felt like something physical striking him in the chest. He had done it as a gesture of trust, a private signal between the 2 of them that he intended this marriage to mean something more than a business arrangement dressed up in silk and flowers. He had given her, willingly, the keys to a structure he had spent a decade building and protecting from men exactly like the one in that photograph. "Cross-reference her phone," Monsiok said, and his voice had dropped into a register Suk-Jun had heard only twice before in 11 years of service, the register that preceded decisions from which there was no walking back. "Every call, every message, going back 6 months. I want to know who she's actually been talking to." It took less than 20 minutes for the picture to fully assemble itself, and each piece that landed on the desk in front of him felt like another door quietly closing on the life he'd believed he was building. A burner number, contacted 11 times over 4 months, always late at night, always for calls lasting less than 90 seconds, long enough to relay information, too short to trace with any conventional method. That same number cross-referenced against an intercepted financial memo from a rival operation, one his people had picked up 8 weeks earlier and filed away as low-priority chatter, now suddenly reading like a confession. An internal note discussing asset transfer opportunities via the linker connection, and a projected timeline that aligned, disturbingly precisely, with the date of his and Stephanie's wedding. "There's more," Sukjun said quietly, sliding a final page across the desk. "We traced the debt. Miss Linker's family estate has been underwater for close to 3 years, creditors, most of them tied directly to Vasilenko-adjacent lending operations. The kind of debt that doesn't get forgiven, it gets leveraged." He paused. "Our read is that she was approached before she ever met you, sir, not after. The engagement wasn't incidental to their plan. It may have been the plan." Munsiok sat with that for a long, silent moment, and something in his chest that he had spent 10 years training himself never to feel in front of another person rose up anyway, cold and sharp, and entirely unwelcome. He thought of every small gift he'd given her over 18 months, the jewelry, the access, the quiet extension of trust that had felt, at the time, like the first real risk he'd allowed himself to take since the purge that put him in power. He had believed, foolishly, dangerously, that loving someone meant giving them the keys to the parts of himself he kept locked from everyone else. He had handed a rival syndicate the keys to his empire and called it romance. "The wedding is in 6 weeks," he said finally, very quietly. "Yes, sir." "And the transfer window in that memo?" "Closes the week after the ceremony," Sukjun confirmed. "Once the marriage is legally finalized, joint asset structures across 2 of your 3 commercial jurisdictions become significantly harder to contest or reverse. Our analysts believe that's the actual target date, not the wedding itself, what the wedding legally unlocks." Munsiok rose from his chair and walked once more to the window. The city spread out below him exactly as it had been every night this week, indifferent, glittering, entirely unaware that the man staring down at it had just learned his own engagement had been engineered from the very beginning as an act of financial warfare against everything he'd built. He thought of Jennifer sitting across from him hours earlier, telling the truth at real cost to herself, because it was the right thing to do for a frightened boy who wasn't even her own responsibility. He thought of Stephanie in that same room, weeks ago, promising him forever with tears that had looked, at the time, entirely real. He didn't yet know which parts of the last 18 months had been genuine and which had been performance calibrated for exactly this outcome. Whether any part of what Stephanie had shown him had been true, or whether he had simply been the mark in the longest, most patient con anyone had ever attempted to run on him. That question sat in his chest, like a blade he hadn't yet decided how to remove. "She's still planning to move forward with the ceremony," he said, not quite a question. "As far as we can tell, sir, she has no idea we've made any of these connections. The engagement dinner is still on her calendar. So is the summit with the other families next month, the one where you're formally announcing the merger of your commercial holdings under the marriage structure." Munsiok turned that information over slowly, and something began to shift behind his eyes, the particular cold clarity that had carried him through every real crisis of his career. The moment where grief and fury gave way to strategy, where a man stopped asking how badly he'd been hurt and started calculating exactly how to make the people responsible pay for it in full view of everyone whose respect they'd need to survive afterward. "Good," he said finally. "Then we let her keep planning." Sukjun looked up sharply. "Sir." "She wants a wedding," Munsiok said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very still, the voice of a man who had just decided something with total finality. "She wants an audience of every family and every rival who matters watching her secure everything she's spent years working toward. I intend to give her exactly that audience." He turned from the window, and for the first time since this entire investigation began, something that might have been the beginning of a plan moved behind his expression. Only I'm going to be the one who decides what they actually watch. If Munsiok's next move against betrayal like this speaks to something in you, if you've ever needed to see someone claw back power from a person who thought they'd already won, you don't have to wait for the next chapter to feel that satisfaction. We've got 2 full novels waiting for you right now, stories of women who faced their own reckonings and came out the other side whole. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to start reading tonight, or if you're watching on your TV, grab your phone and scan the QR code on your screen. One story will break your heart, the other will heal it. Go get both. What Munsiok didn't yet know was that his silence over the last 2 days had already made Stephanie nervous enough to make her first real mistake. She had noticed it the way women like her always noticed things, not through anything he'd said, but through the absence of things he usually said. He hadn't asked about the wedding invitations in 3 days. He hadn't mentioned the summit dinner, though it was barely 6 weeks out, and normally he'd have opinions about seating and security by now. He'd been quieter at breakfast, more distant during their evening calls, and when she'd asked him directly, 2 nights ago, whether something was troubling him, he'd simply said business, in a tone that gave her nothing to work with at all. Stephanie had built her entire life on reading rooms and reading men, and the room she was reading now told her, with mounting unease, that something had shifted beneath her without her quite being able to name what. So she did what she always did when she felt the ground moving under her. She moved first. It took her less than a day to put the plan together. She'd learned long ago that the fastest way to end a threat was to make it look like it had never been credible in the first place, and Jennifer's quiet insistence on her innocence, however calmly delivered, was still a threat as long as Munsiok kept asking questions that had no business being asked. A stolen document case with no evidence attached was an accusation. A stolen document case with a paper trail was a conviction. Stephanie understood the difference the way she understood most things, instinctively, ruthlessly, without a flicker of hesitation about what it would cost the person on the other end of it. The receipt itself was almost laughably simple to produce. A contact from her old life, the kind of contact a woman raised the way she'd been raised always kept somewhere in her phone, filed under an innocuous name, useful precisely because he asked no questions and left no trail that led back to her directly, forged a pawnshop transaction dated 3 days after the document case disappeared, showing a woman matching Jennifer's general description selling a distinctive antique silver clasp for a fraction of its true value. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be perfect. It needed only to exist, tucked where someone would eventually find it, giving Priya and the rest of the household staff a tidy, undeniable reason to finally sign the termination papers that had been sitting untouched on a desk for 2 days. She slipped it into Jennifer's locker herself, late on a Thursday evening when the staff quarters were empty, wearing gloves she'd later burn in the estate's private incinerator, feeling nothing that resembled guilt as she did it, only the cold, practical satisfaction of a problem being efficiently solved. She had done far worse than this to protect far less than what she stood to lose. A housemaid's reputation was a small, easily replaced thing. Her freedom, and the debt hanging over her family that Munsiok's fortune was meant to finally erase, was not. The receipt was discovered the following morning by one of the junior staff doing a routine locker check, and by 10 a.m. it had made its way, exactly as Stephanie intended, into Priya's hands. And from Priya's hands directly to Munsiok's desk, along with a note requesting his final authorization to proceed with Jennifer's immediate dismissal. He sat with the receipt in his hand for a long time after Priya left the room. It was a good forgery. He would give Stephanie that much. Whoever she'd used had a genuine eye for the small details that made a document convincing. The correct letterhead for a pawnshop 3 boroughs away that Jennifer had no obvious connection to. A transaction number that would hold up under casual inspection. Even a signature that approximated, without quite matching, the handwriting on Jennifer's original employment application. It was the work of someone who understood that most people, faced with a piece of paper that looked official, rarely thought to question it any further. But Munsiok was not most people, and he had already spent 2 days learning exactly how far Stephanie was willing to go to protect whatever she was hiding, which meant that a piece of paper conveniently appearing at precisely the moment he'd begun asking real questions told him considerably more about his fiancée than it told him about his housemaid. He thought of Jennifer sitting across from him in this same study, hands folded, voice steady even as she handed him information that could have easily been kept to herself, choosing honesty over her own safety because it was the right thing to do for a frightened boy. He thought of the 10-minute camera gap that traced back to Stephanie's own administrative override, the burner phone calls, the debt, the timeline that aligned so precisely with his wedding date that it could not possibly be coincidence. And now this, a piece of paper appearing exactly on schedule, exactly convenient enough to end a problem that had started asking questions Stephanie clearly didn't want answered. He almost laughed. Almost. There was something darkly, coldly amusing about watching an amateur try to run a con on a man who had spent a decade surviving the most sophisticated betrayals his own family's world had to offer. Stephanie had learned to manipulate rooms full of socialites and charity boards, people conditioned by breeding and etiquette never to look too closely at a woman who smiled the right way and cried at the right moments. She had never had to manipulate someone who had built his entire life on assuming everyone was lying to him until proven otherwise. He picked up his phone and called for Diho. "You've seen this," Munsiok said when his security chief arrived, sliding the receipt across the desk. Diho studied it for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral in the way it always was when he suspected his boss already had an opinion and was waiting to see if it matched his own. "Priya's asking for authorization to terminate. She seems satisfied it's genuine." "It's not genuine," Munsiok said it flatly, without a trace of doubt. "The transaction number format is wrong. That particular shop switched to a new receipt system 8 months ago after new licensing regulations went through. Whoever forged this used an outdated template." He'd noticed it within the first 30 seconds of looking at it, a small technical detail that meant nothing to anyone who didn't spend their professional life scrutinizing documents for exactly this kind of flaw, but meant everything to a man who did. This was planted, recently, by someone with access to Jennifer's locker and a reason to want her gone before I finish asking questions about the camera outage. Diho's jaw tightened, the particular controlled anger of a man who had spent 15 years protecting this house and did not take kindly to discovering it had been used as a weapon against one of its own staff. "You want me to pull the corridor footage from the staff quarters. See who accessed the lockers Thursday night." "I already know who it was." Munsiok's voice was quiet, certain, entirely without heat. "What I want is different." He leaned back in his chair, and something in his expression shifted into the particular stillness Diho had learned, over 15 years, to recognize as the moment his boss stopped reacting to a problem and started constructing its solution. "I want you to authorize the termination paperwork to move forward. Slowly. Let Priya believe I'm satisfied with the evidence. Let word reach Stephanie that Jennifer's dismissal is being finalized." "Sir," Diho started, something close to protest in his voice, and Munsiok held up a hand before he could continue. "Jennifer isn't going anywhere. I'll handle that privately. She'll be reassigned quietly to oversight duties at my commercial property offices, out of this house entirely, somewhere Stephanie has no reach and no reason to look for her. On paper, for exactly as long as I need it, the termination will appear to be moving forward." His eyes had gone very cold, very focused, the look of a man building a structure piece by piece and testing every joint before he trusted it to hold weight. "I want Stephanie to believe her plan worked, completely. I want her confident enough in that victory that she stops being careful." Diho was quiet for a moment, turning the strategy over, and then something that was almost admiration crossed his weathered face. "And while she's celebrating, you put full surveillance on her private movements. Not the estate cameras, those she knows how to manipulate. I want personal coverage. Her phone discreetly monitored. Anyone she meets outside this house, tracked and photographed. Every call to that burner number logged with a timestamp." Munsiok's voice had dropped lower, and there was something in it now that Diho recognized from years back, from the early days of the purge, the voice of a man who had learned exactly how patient he could be when patience was the only path to certainty. She thinks she just solved a problem. I want to know exactly what she does next, now that she believes there's no one left watching. Di-ho nodded slowly. It'll take resources, if she notices. She won't notice. She's never once had to look for anyone watching her, because she's never once considered that anyone in this house might be smarter than she assumes. Munseok stood, walking to the window as he so often did now when a decision had settled fully into place, the city glittering below him, indifferent to the quiet war being waged 40 floors above its streets. She grew up believing people like Jennifer are invisible. That belief is about to become the most useful weakness she has. There was a question sitting underneath all of it that Munseok hadn't yet let himself ask out loud, not even to Di-ho, not even in the privacy of his own study. A question that had nothing to do with document cases or offshore codes or rival syndicates, and everything to do with the 18 months that had come before any of this. He had known, intellectually, for 2 days now, that his engagement had likely been engineered from its very beginning as an act of calculated financial warfare. But knowing a thing and feeling the full weight of it were two very different exercises, and standing at that window now, watching the fake pawnshop receipt still lying on his desk behind him, proof that Stephanie was willing to destroy an innocent woman's entire life without a flicker of hesitation the moment she felt cornered. He found himself wondering, for the first time with real dread instead of cold, strategic distance, exactly what she would be willing to do to him. Once she realized the trap wasn't the one she thought she'd built. He pushed the thought aside. There would be time for that reckoning later. Right now, there was only the work in front of him, and the particular, disciplined satisfaction of watching a woman walk confidently toward a fate she had no idea was already waiting for her. By that evening, word had reached Stephanie exactly as Munseok intended it to. Priya delivered it herself, almost apologetic in her relief that the matter had finally been resolved, mentioning in passing over evening tea that Mr. Munseok had reviewed the pawnshop documentation and authorized the paperwork to proceed. Stephanie received the news with a carefully composed expression of regret. How unfortunate, she murmured, that it had come to this, though of course she understood these things had to be handled properly. And the moment she was alone in her private sitting room, door closed, the composure dissolved into something far closer to triumph. She poured herself a glass of wine she didn't particularly want, simply for the pleasure of the ritual, of marking the moment the way she'd learned to mark every small victory in a life built entirely on managing outcomes other people never realized were being managed. The maid was handled. The questions about the camera footage, whatever Munseok had actually noticed, would surely die down now that there was a tidy explanation sitting on his desk, signed and dated and impossible to argue with. She had 6 weeks left until the wedding, 6 weeks to keep every remaining piece exactly where it needed to be. And for the first time in days, sitting alone with her wine in the fading evening light, Stephanie Linker allowed herself to believe that she had, once again, successfully protected everything that mattered. She had no idea that 4 floors below her, in a small windowless room lined with monitors, Di-ho was quietly initiating a surveillance protocol that would track her every movement, every call, every private meeting for the next 6 weeks, building, patiently and methodically, the exact record that would eventually be projected in front of every family and rival who mattered, in a room full of people watching her unravel in real time. She had no idea that the maid she just successfully destroyed on paper was, at that very moment, being quietly transferred to a private office across the city, her sister's medical care fully secured, her position more protected under Munseok's personal authority than it had ever been under Stephanie's roof. And she had absolutely no idea that the man she was about to marry, the man she'd spent 18 months believing she'd successfully deceived, had just spent the entire day proving, methodically and without a trace of visible emotion, that he was several steps ahead of every move she thought she'd made in secret. If you're sitting there right now shaking your head at a woman cruel enough to frame an innocent housemaid just to save herself, if you felt that anger rise up watching her sip that wine, so sure she'd won, then let her know exactly how this feels. Type "busted" in the comments right now, because in a few chapters, She is going to understand precisely what it means to underestimate the people she thought she could step on without consequence. The proof of exactly how many steps ahead he stood arrived 4 nights later, at 11:58 in the evening, in the form of a single grainy figure moving through the darkened hallway toward his study door. It had taken almost no effort at all to set the bait. Munsiok had simply mentioned it, once, at dinner 3 nights earlier, in the particular offhand tone of a man discussing something too tedious to dwell on, that his IT team had flagged a vulnerability in the cloud backup system for the commercial holdings, and that until it was patched, he'd had an unencrypted physical drive prepared as a stopgap, currently sitting in the locked bottom drawer of his study desk. He'd said it the way he might have mentioned a dry cleaning pickup, barely looking up from his plate, and Stephanie had said nothing in response beyond a polite, uninterested nod, exactly as he'd expected. But he'd watched her hands, that night, the way her fingers had gone very slightly still around the stem of her wine glass, for just a fraction of a second before she resumed cutting into her dinner. And he'd known, with the particular certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life reading the smallest tells in people trying not to be read, that the information had landed exactly where he'd intended it to. Now, 4 nights later, Di-ho stood beside him in the darkened security office, both men watching a bank of monitors in absolute silence, the only sound in the room the low electronic hum of servers and the occasional soft click of the recording system adjusting its focus. The night vision feed rendered the mansion's east corridor in cool shades of green and gray, every shadow sharpened into unnatural clarity, and at 11:58 precisely, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had rehearsed this exact route in her mind more than once. Stephanie. She was dressed down for the occasion, none of the silk and diamonds Munsiok had grown used to seeing her in, dark leggings, a fitted black top, hair pulled back tight against her skull, the practiced uniform of someone who understood, on some level, that this was not the first time in her life she'd needed to move through a house unseen. She paused at each doorway along the corridor, listening, waiting, and Munsiok found himself holding his own breath without quite meaning to, watching the woman he'd nearly married move through his home like a stranger casing a target. "She's good," Di-ho murmured, quiet admiration bleeding into the observation despite himself. "Trained or close to it." "Or simply experienced," Munsiok said, his voice flat, though something underneath it had gone very tight. "This isn't the first house she's done this in." She reached the study door at 12:01, and Munsiok watched her produce a slim tool from her waistband. Not a stolen key, he noted, filing the detail away, which meant she either didn't trust that a key might have been changed or simply preferred not to leave evidence of having ever possessed one. It took her under 90 seconds to work the lock, efficient and practiced, and then she was inside the room he'd occupied every day for the better part of a decade, moving through the darkness toward his desk with the sure, unhesitating steps of someone who had studied its layout in advance. She went straight for the bottom drawer. Munsiok watched her hands work the lock there too, faster this time, and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with satisfaction and everything to do with grief he hadn't yet given himself permission to feel, the particular grief of watching, with his own eyes, in real and undeniable footage, exactly how thoroughly the woman he'd trusted had already reduced their entire relationship to a set of exploitable logistics. She wasn't hesitating. She wasn't second-guessing. She was moving through his private study with the calm efficiency of someone completing a task she'd already fully reconciled herself to. At 12:04, the second figure appeared. He came not from the main hallway, but from the service corridor near the kitchens, the same route Jennifer had described the silver-trimmed courier using weeks earlier, and Munsiok felt Di-ho go very still beside him as the man's face resolved into focus on the monitor. The same courier, unmistakably, the same build and gait from the traffic camera still they'd pulled days before, now standing inside Munsiok's own study at midnight as though he owned the room. "Audio," Munsiok said quietly, and Di-ho reached forward to adjust the feed, the ambient hum of the room sharpening into something closer to clarity. catching the low murmur of two voices that had clearly done this before, comfortable with each other in the particular way of people who had built a working relationship over months rather than days. "You said the drive would be here." The courier's voice, low, edged with impatience. "I don't see it." "It's here." Stephanie's voice, tight, focused. None of the warmth she performed so beautifully in front of company anywhere in it now. She was on her knees in front of the open drawer, hands moving through its contents with quick precision. "Give me a moment. I'm not the one who left it unlocked in a house full of security cameras, so forgive me if I want to be careful." "You've had 3 days to get this." Fedorov is losing patience. He's starting to wonder if you're capable of finishing what you started, or if we need to find another way in. Something in Stephanie's posture changed at that. Munsiok watched it happen on the monitor, the particular flinch of a person hearing a threat they'd heard before and knew better than to take lightly. "Tell Fedorov I don't need reminding what happens to my family if this doesn't close before the wedding. I'm handling it." He also wants to know why you haven't secured the second set of codes yet. The ones for the Geneva account. That was supposed to happen 2 weeks ago. "It will happen." Stephanie's hands stilled for a moment in the drawer, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped lower, sharper, something close to genuine fear threading through the words for the first time since the conversation began. "Munsiok's been different lately. Quieter. I don't know if it's nerves about the wedding or something else, but I'm not going to risk everything by rushing the last piece. If he suspects anything before the transfer window closes, we both lose. Not just me." The courier crouched beside her, and his voice, when it came again, had lost its impatience and taken on something colder, more deliberate. "That's not really your concern anymore, is it? You signed the agreement. Your family's debt gets absorbed, you get the offshore account Fedorov promised, and we get access to territorial financing structures that have kept us locked out of London for 6 years. That was the deal. It doesn't matter how nervous your fiancé gets between now and the wedding. It matters that you finish." "I know what I signed." There was an edge in Stephanie's voice now that hadn't been there before, something brittle underneath the composure she wore so effortlessly in every other room of this house. "Don't lecture me about the terms of my own arrangement." "Then don't give me a reason to." He straightened, glancing once toward the study door, the particular alertness of a man who had done this kind of work long enough to trust his instincts over his patience. "Get the drive. We're done here in 90 seconds, agreement or no agreement." Stephanie finally located what she was looking for, a small external drive, exactly where Munsiok had planted it, deliberately unremarkable, a single unlabeled black rectangle that she lifted from the drawer with something close to relief crossing her face. "This is it. Copy it now. I'm not walking out of this house with the physical drive in my pocket if security does a sweep tonight." She produced a laptop from a small bag Munsiok hadn't noticed her carrying, and for nearly 2 full minutes, the two of them crouched together in the low glow of the screen while a progress bar filled, neither speaking, the silence between them heavy with the particular tension of two people who trusted the arrangement between them considerably less than either was willing to admit out loud. When the transfer finished, Stephanie replaced the drive exactly where she'd found it, closed the drawer, and rose to her feet, smoothing down her leggings with hands that Munsiok, watching from 4 floors below, could see were not entirely steady. "Tell Fedorov the Geneva codes will be secured within the week," she said. "And tell him if he threatens my family again instead of trusting me to finish this properly, he can find someone else stupid enough to marry into a syndicate boss's bed to get what he wants." The courier said nothing to that, simply inclined his head and moved back toward the service corridor the way he'd come, and Stephanie stood alone in the study for a moment longer, looking around the room at the desk, the shelves, the window where Munsiok so often stood staring down at the city below, with an expression that Munsiok, watching in the darkened security office, could not entirely read. Something that might have been regret, or might simply have been the particular fatigue of a woman keeping too many plates spinning at once. Then she turned and left, locking the door carefully behind her, disappearing back down the corridor with the same measured, unhurried pace she'd arrived with, as though nothing at all unusual had happened in the room she was leaving behind. The recording ran another 30 seconds of empty hallway before Diho finally reached forward and paused the feed. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Munsiok sat perfectly still, his hands folded in front of him on the desk, his face giving away nothing at all, though Diho, who had known him 15 years, who had stood beside him through the purge and every crisis since, recognized the particular stillness for exactly what it was. Not calm. Containment. Fedorov, Munsiok said finally, testing the name. That's the head of the Vasilenko faction. Yes, sir. Confirmed identity, confirmed leadership position within the organization. Diho's voice had gone careful, the tone of a man delivering information he already knew would land like a blow. She named him directly and named the arrangement. Debt absorption, offshore account, territorial access in exchange for the codes. We have it all on record, audio and video both. And the second set, Munsiok said, Geneva. If she secures those before we move, sir, they'll have functional access to both major commercial structures. Combined with the London account she's already copied tonight, that's close to complete control over your entire European financial architecture. Diho hesitated, and then added, quieter, we have enough right now to end this immediately. Tonight, if you wanted. Munsiok said nothing for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the frozen frame of the empty hallway on the monitor in front of him. The corridor his fiancée had just walked back down, locking a door behind her, already composing herself for the version of tonight she intended to present tomorrow morning at breakfast, warm and easy and entirely untroubled, as though she hadn't just handed a rival syndicate the keys to his empire with her own 2 hands. He thought of the banquet 6 weeks away. The guest list passed 200 names, drawn from every family and every rival whose respect and fear he had spent a decade earning. He thought of Fedorov's name, spoken in his own study, in his own house, by the woman he'd asked to spend the rest of his life beside him. Ending it tonight, quietly, privately, would satisfy nothing. It would simply remove a problem. And Jang Munsiok had not built an empire by simply removing problems when he had the opportunity, instead, to make an example so complete that no one watching would ever again mistake his patience for weakness. No, he said finally, and something in his voice had gone very cold, very final, the sound of a decision closing like a door. We wait. We let her finish. We let her secure Geneva, let her believe every single piece of this is falling exactly into place. He turned at last to look at Diho directly, and whatever remained of the man who had almost married her, standing in an elevator 4 nights ago thinking he'd finally found the one exception worth the risk, was entirely gone from his expression now. And then, in front of every single person whose opinion she was counting on to protect her, we let her watch every second of this footage on a screen the size of a wall. That screen the size of a wall was 6 weeks away when Munsiok made his decision, and now, standing at the edge of a ballroom filled with 200 of the most powerful people in 2 worlds, it hung dark and waiting above the stage behind him, exactly as he'd planned. The engagement banquet had unfolded, up to this point, precisely the way Stephanie had spent months orchestrating it. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across white tablecloths and towering floral arrangements imported for the occasion. A string quartet played the same pieces she'd argued about with him over the phone weeks ago, back when he'd still believed the argument was about music, and not about how long she needed to keep him distracted while a courier moved through his study. Syndicate heads from 3 continents sat beside old money families who had no idea what business actually funded the empire hosting them tonight, all of them dressed in the particular glittering uniform of people who had never once had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. Stephanie moved through the room in a gown the color of champagne, radiant, gracious, accepting congratulations with the same practiced warmth she'd shown Jennifer in that hallway 6 weeks earlier, right before she'd threatened to end her life in this city. She had secured the Geneva codes 4 days ago. Munsiok knew this because Diho's surveillance had captured every detail, including the celebratory dinner she'd had with herself that evening, alone, a bottle of wine she didn't share with anyone, the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed she had successfully completed the longest and most delicate con of her life. She had no idea that every code she'd copied, every account she believed she'd compromised, had been quietly restructured behind the scenes over the past 6 weeks. The real financial architecture moved to entirely new vaults she and Fedorov would never locate. She had stolen nothing but decoys, dressed up convincingly enough to survive her scrutiny. She simply didn't know that yet. Munsiok rose from his seat at the head table at exactly 9:40, and the room's attention shifted toward him the way a room always shifted toward the man everyone in it either feared or wanted something from. A server handed him a champagne flute he had no intention of drinking from. Stephanie looked up at him with an expression of practiced anticipation, already composing, he suspected, the gracious smile she'd wear when he announced the wedding date the guests had all gathered to hear confirmed. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Munsiok began, and his voice carried easily across the ballroom without needing amplification, the particular quality of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how to command a room without raising his voice. "Many of you have known my family for years. Some of you knew my father and understand what it cost to build what we've built. Tonight was meant to be a celebration of everything I believed I was about to add to that legacy." He paused, letting his eyes move slowly across the room, across faces that had watched him grow into the position he now held, across rivals who had spent years waiting for any sign of weakness they could exploit. "Instead, I want to show you something. I think it's important that everyone in this room understands exactly what kind of trust I nearly extended to someone who did not deserve it." He nodded once toward the back of the room, and the massive screen behind the stage flickered to life. Stephanie's smile faltered for the first time all evening. The first thing that played was audio only, the room's speakers carrying it with startling clarity into every corner of the ballroom, her own voice, cold and precise, 6 weeks old now, cutting through 200 conversations that died almost instantly into stunned silence. "This family does not forget who cleans its floors." And then, underneath it, Jennifer's steady, dignified reply, "I understand my place here, ma'am. I have always understood it." A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uncertain, guests glancing at each other, at Stephanie, whose face had gone very pale beneath her careful makeup, her hand tightening around the stem of her own champagne glass hard enough that Munsiok, watching closely from the stage, wondered briefly if it might shatter. "That was a private conversation," Munsiok continued, his voice never rising, never breaking from its even, measured cadence, "between my fiancé and a member of my household staff, threatening to destroy that young woman's entire livelihood over the theft of a document case. A theft, I should mention, that Miss Linker herself orchestrated." He turned, and the screen shifted again, this time to the night vision footage from his study, sharp and unmistakable even in its cool green tones. Stephanie, dressed in black, kneeling in front of his desk drawer at midnight, working the lock with practiced hands. The murmur in the room became something louder now, something closer to a collective gasp, chairs shifting, whispered names passing rapidly from table to table. Stephanie had risen halfway from her seat, one hand extended toward the head table, as though she might physically stop what was happening, her mouth already forming the beginning of some explanation that died the moment the audio began to play alongside the footage. "You said the drive would be here." "It's here. Give me a moment. I'm not the one who left it unlocked in a house full of security cameras. You've had 3 days to get this. Fedorov is losing patience." The name landed in that ballroom like a physical blow, and Munsiok watched, with a coldness he'd carried carefully banked for 6 weeks, as several of the syndicate heads in attendance went rigid in their seats, recognizing exactly who Fedorov was and precisely what his involvement meant. This was no longer domestic scandal. This was treason of the highest order, playing out in real time on a screen the size of a wall, in front of the exact audience whose respect Stephanie had spent 18 months carefully cultivating. "Stop this," Stephanie said, her voice cutting across the room, no longer composed, no longer performing warmth for anyone watching. "Munsiok, stop this right now. You don't understand what you're—" "I understand precisely what I'm looking at," Munsiok said, and for the first time all evening his voice sharpened, cutting through her interruption with an edge that made several guests near the front visibly flinch. I understand that you accepted an arrangement with a rival faction to absorb your family's debt in exchange for the offshore codes tied to my commercial holdings. I understand that you planted false evidence against an innocent employee to cover your movements when you realized I was asking questions. And I understand that every gift I gave you over the past 18 months, every piece of trust I extended, was calculated by you as an asset to be liquidated. He let that settle across the room, watching the color drain further from her face with each word. What I don't yet understand, Stephanie, is how you managed to sit across from me for 18 months and never once let me see any of this. That, I suppose, is the only part of tonight that still genuinely impresses me. The screen shifted one final time, to the footage of the courier's threat against a terrified 17-year-old pantry steward. His quiet, menacing instruction that the boy see nothing and say nothing about what moved through the estate's service entrance at night. A woman near the front of the room, one of the old money wives who had spent the evening admiring Stephanie's gown, made an audible sound of disgust, and it seemed to break something loose in the room, a dam giving way, conversation erupting on all sides now, no longer whispered but open, furious, disbelieving. Diho appeared at the edge of the stage, flanked by 2 security personnel, and Munsiok gave him a single nod. Stephanie was still standing at her table, the ring on her finger catching the chandelier light as she raised her hand instinctively, as though she might still find some argument capable of undoing what 200 people had just watched with their own eyes. You framed an innocent woman, Munsiok said, quieter now, though the room had gone silent enough that his voice still carried to every table. A woman who protected a child from the very people you were working with, at real personal cost to herself, because it was the right thing to do. You had every advantage this life could offer, and you chose to use it to destroy someone who had none. He crossed the short distance between the stage and her table, and the room seemed to hold its breath collectively as he reached for her hand, removing the ring from her finger with a gentleness that felt, somehow, more devastating than any anger could have been. This ends tonight, publicly, so that everyone in this room understands exactly what kind of consequence follows this kind of betrayal, whether it happens in a boardroom or in a hallway meant for people you assumed would never be believed. Stephanie's composure finally shattered entirely, tears rising fast and real now, though whether from grief or fury or simple terror at the men in the room who now understood precisely what her arrangement with Fedorov meant for her own safety. Munsiok could no longer tell, and no longer particularly cared to. "You have no idea what you've just done," she said, her voice breaking, low enough now that only those closest could hear it. "Fedorov doesn't forgive people who embarrass him in front of a room like this. You've just made me a liability to people who don't let liabilities walk away." Munsiok looked at her for a long moment, the ring still resting in his closed palm, and something that might once have been sympathy flickered somewhere behind his eyes, before it hardened over completely into something far colder. "That," he said quietly, "was your choice the moment you decided my empire was worth more to you than honesty ever was. If you believe a woman like Jennifer deserves to see her name cleared in front of the very people who doubted her, if you're sitting there right now with your heart pounding, wanting Stephanie to feel every second of that humiliation, hit that like button and let this story know exactly whose side you're on, because what happens to Stephanie next, in front of the very syndicate she just betrayed, is only just beginning." She had no answer for that, and the silence that followed her stunned into stillness lasted only as long as it took Diho to close the distance between the stage and her table, his 2 security men falling into step beside him with the calm, unhurried authority of men who had waited a long time for this particular moment. "Miss Linker," Diho said, his voice courteous even now, even here, because that was simply how this house conducted itself, regardless of what the moment called for. "You'll come with us." She didn't fight it. Munsiok watched her gather what remained of her composure in the space of a single breath, the old instincts of a woman raised to perform dignity even in ruin rising up one final time as she allowed herself to be escorted from the ballroom, chin lifted, eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the 200 faces that had watched her unravel in high definition. It was, he thought, The last honest thing he would likely ever see her do. The refusal to beg in front of people who had spent all evening deciding exactly how quickly they intended to forget her name. What happened to her after she passed through those doors was no longer entirely his concern, though he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who knew exactly how his world worked, that Fedorov's people would not be forgiving of an operative who had just been exposed so completely, so publicly. That the entire structure of their London infiltration had collapsed in a single evening. 2 of Fedorov's associates, present in the ballroom under false pretenses as guests of a minor family, had already been quietly intercepted near the coat check by Munsiok's people the moment the footage began playing, their diplomatic protests dying quickly once they understood exactly how many witnesses now stood between them and any version of tonight that ended in their favor. Syndicate arbitration was not a court of law. It did not deal in second chances, and Munsiok had long ago stopped feeling responsible for consequences that people brought entirely upon themselves. The ballroom took a long moment to remember how to breathe normally again after the doors closed behind her. Conversation returned slowly, in fragments, guests turning to each other in low voices, some scandalized, some frankly delighted by the spectacle, all of them recalibrating, in real time, exactly where the balance of power in this city had just shifted. Munsiok let it happen. He stood at the front of the room for a moment longer, the ring still closed in his palm, feeling something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized had been clenched tight for 6 straight weeks. Then he turned and asked for one more thing before the evening could properly continue. He had Jennifer brought to the ballroom. She arrived hesitant, uncertain, still in the simple dark dress she'd worn to what she'd believed was a private meeting about her reassignment paperwork, clearly having no idea she was about to walk into a room full of the city's most powerful families in the middle of what had just become the most talked-about scandal London's underworld had seen in a decade. She stopped just inside the doorway, scanning the crowd, the overturned wine glasses, the particular electric hush of 200 people still processing what they'd witnessed, and Munsiok watched her spine straighten instinctively, the old defensive posture of a woman who had spent her whole life learning to brace for whatever came next in rooms she didn't fully understand. "Please," Munsiok said, crossing the room toward her, his voice carrying easily now that the crowd had gone quiet again, curious, watching. "Come forward, Jennifer. There's nothing here to be afraid of tonight." She walked toward him slowly, and he could see the questions moving behind her careful expression. Why she'd been summoned, what this gathering had to do with her, whether whatever had just clearly happened in this room somehow put her in further danger rather than less. He understood that fear. He'd asked her 6 weeks ago to trust a man she barely knew with a truth that could have cost her everything, and she had done it anyway, because it was right, without any guarantee that trust would ever be returned in kind. He intended to return it now, in full, in front of every witness who mattered. 6 weeks ago, he said, turning to address the room as much as her, this woman was accused of a theft she did not commit. Evidence was manufactured against her. Her livelihood and the well-being of the family she supports was threatened by someone who assumed her position in this house, made her voice worth less than her silence. He let that land across the room, watching several faces shift with visible discomfort, the particular guilt of people who had, perhaps, made similar assumptions themselves without ever once being made to confront it. "I want it understood, publicly, tonight, that Jennifer Coffers is innocent of every accusation made against her, that she showed more integrity in a single conversation in this house than I encountered in 18 months from someone I trusted with everything I own." His voice softened, just slightly, as he turned fully to face her, and that this house owes her a debt it intends to repay properly. Jennifer's composure, so carefully held for 6 straight weeks of quiet dread and uncertainty, finally began to crack, her eyes bright with tears she was clearly fighting to keep from falling in front of a room full of strangers. "You don't owe me anything, sir," she said, quiet, though the room was silent enough now that her voice carried anyway. "I only told the truth." "In a house like this," Munsiok said, In a world like the one most of these people occupy, the truth is rarer than anyone likes to admit. You told it anyway, knowing exactly what it might cost you. I don't intend to let that go unanswered. He gestured, and Diho stepped forward with a leather folder Munsiok had prepared days earlier, once the outcome of tonight had become certain enough to plan for properly. He opened it himself, holding it out to her, and Jennifer's eyes moved across the document inside with visible confusion before understanding began to dawn, slow and disbelieving. "This is a management contract," Munsiok said, "for the full operational oversight of my legitimate commercial property portfolio across 3 cities. Estate management, logistics, staffing, everything currently fractured across departments that have never once been properly unified under a single trusted authority. I need someone in that position I can trust completely. Someone who understands what it costs to protect people who have no one else looking out for them, and who does it anyway." He paused. "I can't think of anyone in my organization more qualified for that responsibility than you." Jennifer stared at the document for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly as she took it from him, and the ballroom, watching this unfold in the wreckage of what had begun as an engagement banquet, seemed to hold its breath along with her. "Sir, I clean floors. I don't have any experience running." "You ran this entire estate for 2 years without a single complaint from anyone in this house, all while managing your sister's medical care and protecting a child who wasn't even your responsibility. And you did it while being underestimated by every single person who should have known better." His voice was firm now, certain, the voice of a man who had spent 6 weeks learning exactly what real loyalty looked like and had no intention of ever mistaking it for something lesser again. "You have more capability in you than half the executives currently drawing a salary from my organization. I'm simply asking you to let this house finally see it." The room, which had spent the last 20 minutes reeling from scandal and betrayal, seemed to shift now into something else entirely. A slow ripple of applause beginning somewhere near the back, spreading table by table, guests rising to their feet, and Jennifer stood in the middle of it holding a contract that would change the entire shape of her life, tears finally falling freely now, unashamed, while Munsiok watched her with an expression that had, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, become something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. There was a question sitting quietly beneath all of it, one Munsiok hadn't yet let himself fully examine even as he stood there watching Jennifer accept a future she'd never dared imagine for herself. Whether the respect he felt for her, watching her hold that contract with trembling hands, was purely the gratitude of a man who valued loyalty above all else, or whether it was something else entirely, something he had spent 10 years training himself never to feel for anyone at all. Amara's medical care, he told her quietly as the applause finally settled, would be fully covered under her new executive benefits, permanently, without condition. Danny, the young pantry steward whose fear had kept Jennifer silent for so long, would be moved into a formal apprenticeship program under the estate's new management structure. Safe, protected, no longer vulnerable to men like the one who had threatened him in a dark hallway. Every person in this house who had quietly, invisibly kept it running while men like Munsiok built empires above their heads would, from tonight forward, operate under a woman who understood exactly what that invisible labor cost, because she had lived every day of it herself. Jennifer looked up at him then, past the contract, past the room full of strangers still watching, and something passed between them that neither one of them had words ready to name. Not yet, not tonight, with the wreckage of Stephanie's betrayal still fresh enough to fill the room with its particular electric aftermath. But it was there, quiet and unmistakable, the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in a house built on suspicion and transaction. "Thank you," she said finally, simply, and it was enough. If you've ever watched someone finally get the recognition they should have had all along, if that moment just now made your chest tight with something close to joy, then hit subscribe right now. Because a story like this deserves an audience that shows up for every chapter of payback still to come. And if tonight's story reminded you what it feels like when love finally chooses the right person, we have 2 full novels waiting for you that will take you even deeper into stories exactly like this one. One will break your heart wide open. The other will put it back together. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to start reading tonight, or if you're watching from your TV right now, simply scan the QR code on your screen with your phone. Go get both stories. You've earned a night of reading that actually makes you feel something.